This video is sponsored by Adept Roll, a dice probability calculator available for free to make your games of Warhammer 40k a little more consistent. More about them later on in the video. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and welcome for another episode of the best armies in Warhammer 40k. This is the weekly video series where we go through undefeated results from large events over the past weekend and talk about what is currently winning. And this is for the weekend of March 22nd and 23rd, 2025. This was a huge weekend for competitive 40k, seeing multiple Supermajors go down, including the South Coast Supermajor, as well as the Rocky Mountain Open 2025. However, the results of those events are not particularly exciting, for reasons that we'll discuss later. Now, as a little bit of a PSA before we get into the episode, I won't be live next week since I will be at Adepticon over in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. If anyone wants to come see me while I'm over there, I'm going to be at the booth for my miniature game, Breachstorm, which will be in the front atrium near the registration desk. We're there every year demoing the game, and I really appreciate everyone who comes out to see it. But with that, let's dive in and talk about a metagame breakdown and talk about which factions are currently dominating the competitive scene. And that is a pretty easy answer because the answer is Orks. Thanks to their new March content drop detachment, the Mordaka detachment, Orks have a staggering 7 undefeated results this week, taking down both Supermajor level events by taking up almost literally every single undefeated slot. Although the Rocky Mountain Open did see a tie in an earlier round that is going to thrust one additional player up into an undefeated slot. They were playing Tyranids, and we'll talk about them later, but Orks did take all of the Ect and O slots, all of those players playing Mordaka. The South Coast Supermajor also saw an identical result, with the top 2 players from that Supermajor both going 7 and 0 to take undefeated slots. But not only that, but Orks also took down the Rosehammer 3 GT as well as Kelpie Crusade. Mordaka, as it turns out, very strong. We'll talk about momentarily why it is so strong, but if I were an Ork player, I probably would not expect for this detachment to remain as strong as it currently is. Beyond Orks, however, it is a little bit of the domain of the forces of the hive mind currently. Genestealer Cults going absolutely insane, taking down OP Luck of the Irish, Nurgle 6, as well as the Team Keelhaul GT, and Tyranids, their star god benefactors, also going undefeated at Nurgle 6, as well as getting that undefeated result X0-1. It's a 5-0-1 result with 1 draw at the Rocky Mountain Open. We'll talk about both of those lists as we go on through the video. Space Marines continue to do well, and Deathwatch continues to pull ahead as one of the most effective varieties of Space Marines. They also went undefeated at the Rosehammer 3 event, I believe taking the top spot at that event, and Ultramarines also took down the Goonhammer Open UK, proving that the faction is still very viable post their nerfs in the March data slate update. Interestingly, looking through team events this week, which we don't normally cover on this channel, other Space Marine chapters have started to pop up now that Ultramarines and other compliant supplement chapters have been nerfed significantly. We started to see factions like Raven Guard and Salamanders see some play as well, although we don't typically cover those team style of events on this series. World Eaters also went undefeated at OP Luck of the Irish, Aeldari also going undefeated at the Team Keelhaul GT alongside Genestealer Cults, Astra Militarum undefeated at the All Is Dust GT, Chaos Demons taking down Planet Arcanite, although I will mention that Chaos Demons had a very good showing this weekend. Unfortunately, the faction is largely hard countered by Orks and Mordaka. The fact that Demons have very poor armor saving throws and rely heavily on invulnerable saves means that the fact that the majority of Ork shooting can actually convert into damage on them, and it means that they suffer damage against a Mordaka style list much more quickly than many other more heavily armored factions will. I have a sneaking suspicion that if Mordaka is significantly nerfed, we will see Demons do incredibly well, especially with their new detachments and updates that we saw in the March content update. However, that hasn't sort of materialized yet. It hasn't come out of a warp portal onto the battlefields of the 41st millennium quite yet. And last but certainly not least, Adeptus Custodes took down the OTT 2025. Now, if you are looking to watch any of the coverage for this weekend, we saw both of these Supermajors live streamed over the course of the weekend. The South Coast Supermajor was streamed by Epic Flail HQ, and the Rocky Mountain Open was covered by War Games Live. We also saw the All Is Dust GT being streamed by Tabletop Live. Links to all of those are down in the video description, and if you have any additional channels that were live with Warhammer 40k content this weekend, go ahead and throw them down in the comment section so we can get more eyes on their coverage. And with that, let's move on and talk about some lists just after a word from our sponsor.
This video is sponsored by Adept Roll. Are you tired of guessing whether or not your 40k game plan will pay off? I'm happy to introduce Adept Roll, a dice probability calculator usable on basically any mobile device. For those who haven't used these tools before, they offer a very simple plug-in system where you can input your weapon stats versus defending stats and calculate the probabilities of certain dice results or the average amount of damage that you should expect from a particular attack sequence. Adept Roll is a mobile app designed to give you precise calculations on probabilities for these attacks. It saves you the time and effort of doing the complex math and allows you to focus more heavily on actually outplaying your opponent on the battlefield. I myself use these tools quite often in my games of 40k, especially if I'm identifying two lines of play.
Curious what the math hammer is. According to this, the average damage is 3.
Adept Roll also features profile imports from both Rosterizer and New Recruit, allowing you to import your unit and attack profiles quicker and easier for faster calculations on the fly. So take control of your 40k battles with more powerful dice insight and download Adept Roll for free on iOS or Android by following the links down in the video description.
Now, we're going to start this discussion by talking about the largest event of the weekend, South Coast Supermajor. And we're going to talk about Orks very briefly. As I mentioned before, all of the undefeated placings, and even some additional of the top cut, were playing Orks, and they absolutely dominated these large events this weekend. And as I mentioned previously, I don't expect this detachment to remain at this level of power for super long. I do think that there is some counterplay in the metagame that can be brought against it, but right now it is so efficient that it's able to beat a lot of its counters just by having so many efficient attacks. So let's talk about exactly why that is. Now, Ben Jones took first place at this event, and here's what he was running. He was playing a single Beast Boss, as well as 3 Big Mechs with shock attack guns, a Pain Boy, as well as Zodgrod Wartsnaga. Now, the Beast Boss is particularly important because it grants you a very strong melee counterpunch. You could use the stratagem Orks is still Orks to give the Beast Boys unit that the Beast Boss is joined into full wound rerolls in melee. Because he has anti-monster, anti-vehicle, and can access devastating wounds, the Beast Boss is absolutely brutal with wound rerolls, averaging somewhere around 8 to 12 damage, with no saving throws allowed. Granting this guy wound rerolls is incredible. The Big Mechs with shock attack guns are also incredible, gaining sustained hits 2 from the Mordaka detachment ability, and then also gaining either +1 to hit from tank busters shooting at vehicles, or putting them into Luda squads and getting hit rerolls from those Ludas makes them disgustingly powerful. And then we have a bunch of characters that are going to supplement the army by projecting a lot of board control. This includes a Pain Boy and Zodgrod Wartsnaga. Now we have a Beast Snaga Boys unit for the Beast Boss to join into, as well as a Boys unit for the Pain Boy to join into. And if we scroll down a little bit here as well, we're going to see that we also have a 20 model Gretchen unit. So that Beast Snaga Boy unit is going to act as a melee counterpunch to destroy anything that's going to try to come in and engage with the gun line. But that's even difficult to do because you have so much board control and move blocking potential. The 20 Gretchen can attach in with Zodgrod Wartsnaga. He can give them a massive amount of movement, especially because you can pay a CP to put units in the WOG, and those guys are going to continuously get Zodgrod's massive movement improvement. So he's able to rocket this Gretchen unit across the table, move block your opponent for a couple of turns, and then follow that up with the Boys unit as well. Again, anytime you need to, any of these units can be placed in the WA for all of those abilities. We then have a bunch of trucks to protect the shooting in the early game and move it around the table, some flash kits just for some spot removal, as well as a bunch of Ludas. So the Ludas are only 100 points. They do have a bunch of 2 damage guns, although they're very unreliable. Gaining rerolls when they are shooting in something on an objective, plus sustained hits too, makes them pretty solid. And the biggest thing as well is that they're going to grant those rerolls to any attached character. So the shock attack guns that are firing D6 damage weapons are also going to be gaining those wound rerolls on top. From there, we also have tank bustas, which are good against vehicles or heavy infantry, and because they have high impact weapons, benefit from that sustained hits too pretty significantly. All this comes together to make an army that will simply outshoot basically anything. The Ludas plus the Big Mechs with shock attack guns are not hyper expensive, only 190 points, and they will kill most mid-weight vehicles in the game with shooting attacks. The Beast Boss is able to kill most things with melee attacks, assuming any of these things are touching an objective, obviously. And so if you are trying to present any sort of armored front against it, it's probably going to out-damage you. The downside is that it is difficult for this army to counterattack once engaged, but you have to get through basically 50 models plus invulnerable saves and Pain Boys and Zodgrod Wartsnaga's defensive ability on the Gretchen in order to do that, which is very difficult. So while I think that there are some sort of melee pressure armies that can potentially beat this, I do think that it's so efficient that most of the time it's able to punch through those regardless. So I'm interested to see if there are some changes to the metagame that will bring down the massive win rate of Mordaka in the near future, but I would be anticipating some mechanical changes to the detachment as we move on. Now with that, let's move on to our next faction, Genestealer Cult. The first one that we're going to discuss is Nurgle Mania 6. This was a 40-player GT being held in Germany and was taken down by Tyranids with Genestealer Cults as the runner-up. Jens Gottfried was able to take the faction to a 5-0 record using the Final Day detachment. I've talked about this detachment a couple of times recently, and I remain impressed by it and its ability to very thematically and also very effectively combine Tyranid and Genestealer Cult profiles. In this case, Jens was running a Biophagus with Enraptured Damnation. That's the enhancement to make his unit unshootable by Overwatch, as well as a single Patriarch. We also often see Inhuman Integration also played in one of these characters to grant the unit sustained hits 1, while Tyranid units are spotting for their target, but doesn't look like any of our characters had the capacity to take that in this case. We had an Auto Pistol Acolyte Hybrid unit. That's a big one of 10 models with 6 heavy mining tools, alongside 2 units of 5 with Hand Flamers. We have a Goliath Truck, which can carry some of those guys to the battlefield, as well as 3 units of Achilles Ridge Runners. This is a pretty common loadout here. We have one with a Survey Augur, as well as a Heavy Mortar. He's going to be able to provide +1 AP and ignore cover, targeting a unit that he shoots at with his mortar. Then the other 2 Ridge Runners are able to take advantage of that and stack around additional crossfires on new targets with their heavy mining lasers, flipping off heavy stubber attacks in order to crossfire new things for the melee units to take down. We then have 2 Goliath Rock Grinders, which can also assist at carrying those Acolyte Hybrids to the fight. Lastly, we have a unit of Hybrid Metamorphs. That's likely where that Biophagus is going to jump into, as well as a unit of Pure Strain Genestealers for the Patriarch to hop into. From there, we have a bunch of Tyranids. This includes a Death Leaper, 3 units of Gargoyles, as well as 2 Lictors and a Neurolictor. These guys provide immense amounts of really powerful utility. Death Leaper and the Neurolictor are very resilient frontline combatants that can infiltrate up the table, and the Lictors are fight first, which can make them good roadblocks, and they're also good at pushing forward and applying the Final Day detachment buff. The Gargoyles are the best thing at applying that buff since they're so fast. They can move 12 inches, advance, shoot their gun, move again, and get within 6 inches of enemies. Then that will give your units +1 to hit when they target those units, which will benefit things like the Achilles Ridge Runners once they're trying to shoot you at long range, or even the Hybrid Metamorphs once they get into melee. Those guys also gain access to things like Hyper Ferocity, which can also grant them full wound rerolls in melee, which can make their otherwise relatively mediocre melee profiles incredibly effective. Since the release of this detachment, and especially in the last couple of weeks, we've seen a couple of varieties of the Final Day detachment pop out, but it's cool to see each time, and it's always interesting to see the various compositions of Tyranid inclusions that each of these players take. Sometimes we see a little bit more of a heavy emphasis on the Genestealer Cult units, whereas we're taking only a couple of Tyranid units to enable those buffs. In this case, we're definitely focusing a lot more heavily on those Tyranid units to give ourselves more redundancy in order to apply that +1 to hit effect from the detachment ability. Now moving on back to the standings of the event, let's talk about Caillou Orellana and their Tyranids. Caillou was running a Tyranid invasion fleet, a little bit of a standard Tyranid variety that we've been seeing a lot of in lists that are going undefeated over the last couple months. This includes a Hive Tyrant with Adaptive Biology, as well as a Neuro Tyrant, and a ton of jamming units, a Gargoyle unit, as well as 60 Hormagaunts. They can use Endless Swarm to regenerate themselves onto objectives, meaning that you have to actually remove the entire Hormagaunt unit to make sure that they do not then steal the objective back from you come the Tyranid player's command phase. This also allows you to do some pretty cheeky plays where you can put 1 or 2 Hormagaunts onto an objective, threaten control of it, but keep the rest of the unit out of line of sight, lose those models, and then Endless Swarm them back onto the objective. This is available to any of the teaming mass units, so things like Termagants are also able to do it, but having 20 model units definitely makes it difficult for your opponent to kill all of them. In addition to that, they're also incredibly fast, and they have such high volume of attack that they benefit from the critical effects that Invasion Fleet grants you. Either getting lethal hits improves their damage output against heavy targets pretty significantly, or sustained hits against lighter infantry is incredibly good too. And if you have the CP floating, you can even Adrenal Surge them to actually do some pretty respectable damage for only 130 points. Units like these are really the heart of where Tyranid scoring potential comes from. They already have very solid secondary objective scoring with units like Biovores, but the Hormagaunts also give them almost superlative control over primary, since it's very difficult to prevent Hormagaunts from getting to your expansion objectives and stealing them away with mass OC2 bodies. From there, we do have a Biovore in order to drop Spore Mines to screen out enemies or secure secondaries. We have 2 Exocrines as well as a big Genestealer unit. That's going to give you a relatively long threat range and high damage output unit that can clear space ahead of the army to allow these big monsters, as well as the Hormagaunts to push forward. The Genestealers also get a huge benefit from Adrenal Surge because they have so many attacks and their attacks are much higher value than the Hormagaunts. Getting critical 5s on those guys is actually pretty neat. The downside is that we don't have a Broodlord in this particular build, so oftentimes we'll have to source Synapse separately in order to buff the Genestealers fully, but the Neuro Tyrant can help with that quite a bit, and we also have a Neurolector in here as well to potentially babysit them. We have a single unit of Raveners to act as utility with their uppy downy, a unit of melee bioweapon Tyranid warriors. This is just 3 models, but these guys are also another sort of backline melee unit. They can act as a little bit of a counterpunch. They have enough high value attacks, especially once like sustained hits gets online with them, that they are pretty scary to either units that have been damaged by the Tyranid shooting, the Exocrines and the Tyrannifexes, or units that are relatively light by themselves. And that allows you to not have to commit the larger bricks of Hormagaunts or Genestealers into those units in order to clean them out. We then have 2 Tyrannofexes as well. Pretty interesting build. This one's definitely a little bit more finesse oriented than we've been seeing out of Tyranids more recently. Obviously, Tyranids did get a little bit of a love tap in the most recent March update, where we saw units like Exocrines become more expensive because they and Tyrannofexes were often being taken in triplicate in basically any build. It looks like that has gone the way of the dodo, since armies that were taking all of those did go up significantly, but we also saw some more utility units like Neurolectors go down in points. So in some cases it was a bit of a wash. I think this list probably did go up a little bit, but that does allow Tyranid players to experiment with more widely varied builds rather than simply taking 1 or 2 data sheets at their maximum field allowance. Now, I don't want to brush over one of the other large events of the weekend, the Rocky Mountain Open 2025, a frontline gaming supermajor that ran 229 players. As I mentioned at the top of the video, all of the X and O lists were all playing Orks and all playing Mordaka. However, we did have this one result here from Kenneth Onyebor playing Tyranids at a 5-0-1 record with a 47-point draw in round 4, but going undefeated for the rest of the event. And this event was using standard scoring, not differential scoring, so a draw was a natural result where both players literally scored the exact same number of victory points, which is, to be fair, fairly rare. Kenneth was playing Tyranids and was playing a Crusher Stampede build. This included a Hive Tyrant, as well as a single Biovore, 2 Exocrines, 1 Maliceptor, a unit of Neurogaunts, as well as 3 Norn Emissaries, 2 Ripper Swarms, and 2 Tyrannofexes to make up some backline shooting. The Norn Emissaries are a really interesting inclusion, and this is not the first time that we have seen a build like this that is focusing on Norn units while playing in the Crusher Stampede detachment. Crusher Stampede has kind of very weird synergies with the Norns themselves. While it can grant them +1 to hit, that typically doesn't matter because they already have a weapon skill and ballistic skill of 2. However, the Norns do something that many other Tyranid monsters don't do, which is that they often refuse to die. Tyranid monsters tend to have a relatively mediocre defensive profile. Unless you're talking about some of the really frontline battle tank style bugs like Tyrannofexes, most of them just have a 3+ save and kind of middling toughness. And while they are very cheap and you can get a lot of them, they just get removed wholesale rather than surviving long enough to get the benefit of the Crusher Stampede detachment abilities. The Norn Emissaries don't do that, however. They have a relatively high toughness, excellent saving throws, and can source themselves a feel no pain when they're contesting their singular purpose chosen objective, which is something that very few other things get naturally inside Crusher Stampede. Crusher Stampede can also sometimes source additional damage output from them. The +1 to hit once they're damaged means that they ignore the effects of being bracketed, so once they're down to low wounds counts, the Norn Emissaries still hit on 2s and gain +1 to wound, which can make their otherwise relatively mediocre melee attacks pretty strong. And you can source some additional damage by using things like Massive Impact to deal mortal wounds on the charge, and Corrosive Viscera to automatically deal mortal wounds once they're destroyed, thanks to Deadly Demise. So the Norn Emissaries in Crusher Stampede, I think, are kind of a match made in heaven. While they definitely do reduce the total volume of the Crusher Stampede army and reduce the number of monsters that the army is able to include, their particular profile is very synergistic with a Crusher Stampede build, and obviously that is seeing some success. A couple weeks ago, we saw another triple Norn Emissary Crusher Stampede go 5-0, and today, obviously, we have a 5-0-1 result from Kenneth on this build. Now, with that, let's move over to Portland, Oregon, and talk about the Rose Hammer 3 GT. This was a 72-player GT running 5 rounds, and while it was won by Orks, Deathwatch also was undefeated. Lucas Troller did take the first result with a Mordaka detachment, but Alex Pina went undefeated with Space Marine. In this case, Alex was playing a Black Spear Task Force, being being led by a Gravis Armored Captain with the Tome of the Ectoclades to choose 2 Oath of Moment targets once per game, a Lieutenant with Combi Weapon, as well as a standard Watchmaster. The Watchmasters could join into a unit of Deathwatch veterans that could then embark into a Rhino to provide a very solid and relatively fast counterpunch unit. These guys were rocking 2 Infernus Heavy Bolters, so they had some flamers to clear out screening infantry, but then they were kitted almost entirely for melee. This included 3 sets of power weapons, 4 sets of Deathwatch Thunderhammers, and a Xenophase blade on the Watch Sergeant, as well as many shields as they could equip. Especially when these guys are embarked inside their transport, they have a pretty reasonable threat range thanks to the disembark range, plus the ability to advance and charge from the Watchmaster, and the most important thing is that they can offer a melee counterpunch that you can use to follow up after your kill teams have gone in and engage with the enemy at long range. We then have 3 Deathwatch Terminator squads. These guys did get a little bit of a points update in the March data slate update, but not enough to prevent them from seeing play. Obviously, they are kill team keyworded, so they get all of the synergies from the detachment, in addition to getting 3 Cyclone missile launchers, as well as a couple of Storm Shield equipped standard Terminators, making the unit very difficult to kill and very good at shooting. These guys are just very good all-rounder units that you can use to provide both a melee and ranged punch to your army and act as kind of a resilient front line. We then have an Incursor squad to improve the hit rolls of any of these units. This is especially good if you're fishing for critical hits, if you're looking for lethal hits on the bolt weapons from a lot of the Deathwatch kill teams, or if you're targeting something that isn't necessarily your Oath of Moment target. We're then running 2 Indomitor kill teams, each of those equipped with 3 Eradicators, so a multi-Melta and 2 Melta rifles, as well as 3 Flamestorm Gauntlet equipped Aggressors. We then have 2 Heavy Bolters and 2 standard Heavy Bolt rifles. Pretty standard loadout for the Indomitor kill teams, but we also have those guys supported by an Infiltrator squad, which is probably going to just be protecting the Deathwatch backline by holding their back objective and preventing any enemies from deploying behind them. One big downside that the Deathwatch army typically has is that its screening potential is very limited because its units are typically almost entirely these enormous and expensive kill teams that you can't really allow to be alpha struck by deep strikers, but also can't really protect themselves from deep striking. So infiltrators are kind of a requirement for Deathwatch armies. But last and certainly not least, we have a Storm Speeder Thunderstrike. This is the long-range missile and las cannon equipped Storm Speeder that grants +1 to wound for the army against monster and vehicle units when it targets them. This allows you to combo that with the Incursors to grant +1 to hit and +1 to wound for any of these Indomitor kill teams that are dropping on them. You can then improve the Indomitor kill team's range, AP, or other attack characteristics with special issue ammunition. They gain +2 strength when they are targeting the closest eligible target. So if you're able to use one of your kill teams to clear out any screening units, the follow-up Indomitor kill team can gain +2 strength. So pushing Melta rifles to somewhere around strength 11, heavy bolters up to strength 7, improve their AP, improve their hit roll, and improve their wound roll when combining the Incursor and the Thunderstrike buffs, meaning that most of those bolt weapons are wounding most vehicles on 4s, and the Melta weapons are wounding most vehicles on 2s or 3s. And especially if we're using Kraken rounds to gain +1 AP, we're pushing those AP values up to enormous numbers. AP 3 on the bolt weapons, AP 5 on the Melta weapons. So any converted attack with those impressive stats is most likely to punch through any armor saves. That makes these Indomitor kill teams lethal against armored targets that lack invulnerable saves, and they can do so at a surprisingly long range because they're able to gain additional range bonuses with those special issue ammunition stratagems. This is a pretty classic combination. We saw it win LVO earlier this year, and despite the fact that the army has been toned down slightly, it is still nonetheless effective. And as we've been seeing, probably one of the more effective varieties of Space Marines post the faction receiving nerfs. Now with that, we're going to move over to the UK and talk about the Goonhammer Open March 2025. This was a 65-player GT and was won by Sam Nash, who was rocking Ultramarines. Sam was playing a Gladius Task Force, and if you've been paying attention to Gladius Task Force varieties on this channel over the last couple of months, this army may look very familiar to you. This includes a Gravis Armored Captain with Artificer Armor to improve his saving throw and grant a Feel No Pain, a Lieutenant with Combi Weapon, Marnius Calgar, and Robute Gilliman. We then see 3 Ballistus Dreadnoughts, a Company Heroes unit for Marnius Calgar to join into, a Gladiator Reaper, 1 Infiltrator Squad, a single Invader ATV, a single Scout Squad, and 2 Vindicators. This is basically just the Josh Roberts variety of vehicle-centric Gladius Task Force Ultramarines. It uses a front line of Vindicators with strong armor saves and incredibly strong damage output, followed up by a couple of utility units. I believe that we have had to cut a utility unit because of the points increases this army has received. Most of the heavy vehicles, including the Ballistus Dreadnoughts and the Vindicators, did go up in value in the March Data slate update, Marneus Calgar also went up in value as well, so I think we had to lose a scout squad. However, we're still rocking an Invader ATV, which is a nice cheap utility unit, and rocks a Multi-Melta as well, which can randomly convert for a bunch of damage once you're shooting your Oath of Moment target, which is a nice thing to have. Plus, they have a grenade. They can just run them 12 inches up and throw a grenade at you, and then shoot you with the Multi-Melta, which means sometimes they can just one-tap vehicles when your opponent's not expecting it, which is always surprising. So we have these Vindicators and these utility units to form a front line. We're following that up with a backline of Ballistus Dreadnoughts, which are very difficult to get to grips with because you have to deal with the Vindicators first. Anything that comes up to attack the Vindicators has to deal with Marneus Calgar, and anything that is able to kill Marneus Calgar with his company hero bodyguard unit, which also went up in value, I guess I should say, to give him -1 to wound and a boatload of additional wounds, plus Marneus Calgar's weird wound allocation mechanic, where he can take feel no pains thanks to his Victrix Honor Guard before you actually assign damage to the Victrix Honor Guard, meaning that he takes almost an entire army to remove by himself. Once you've actually dealt with all of that while being shot by the Ballistus Dreadnoughts all game, Roboute Gilliman just comes up to win in the late game. We also have these two characters here, the Combi Weapon Lieutenant and the Gravis Captain. The Gravis Captain can use a lot of defensive stratagems like squad tactics to flee from enemies or Armor of Contempt to improve that 2+ armor save to effectively a 1+ armor save to make him super difficult to deal with. He can get those for free with Rites of Battle, give you an immense amount of command point economy, and act as a very annoying utility unit by himself. And then the Lieutenant with Combi Weapon also gets his free reactive move as well to continuously hide from enemies and try to generate value that way. So these guys can also support the utility units by scoring in the early game before we try to set up our cycle of peace trading to get to the point where Roboute Gilliman can win at the end of the game. Pretty standard variety of Gladius Task Force. It is nice to see Ultramarines still seeing some play after they have been nerfed pretty significantly, but obviously we have seen this variety many times in the past. Now with that, we're going to move over to Santa Rosa, California and talk about the OP look of the Irish GT. This was a 47-player 5-round GT that was won by World Eaters. Genestealer Cults also saw some success at the event, but Taylor Davis did take it down with the Red Boys. And not only did Taylor take World Eaters to an undefeated record, but he also had a, I would say, relatively non-standard variety. It's not super far off the beaten path, but it is a little bit cool. This includes Angron, Lord Invocatus to give our infantry unit Scout, as well as a Lord on Juggernaut with Favorite of Khorne. That's going to give ourselves some additional redundancy when trying to regenerate Angron, and allows you to play Angron a little bit more aggressively, as long as you don't lose your Juggernaut Lord that early. We then have 2 units of 10 Jackals to act as utility, as well as a bunch of 8-bound. Pretty standard stuff so far. 1 unit of 3 8-bound, as well as 3 units of 3 Exalted 8-bound. However, as you can maybe see peeking up at the bottom of the screen here, we also have a Khorne Lord of Skulls. 2 units of Chaos Bond as well to act as utility and annoying to kill units by themselves, but most interestingly is this Lord of Skulls. Now, the most interesting thing about the Lord of Skulls in this variety of army is its Blessed Slaughter ability. This gives it the ability to alter the dice facings of your Blessing of Khorne rolls for each unit it destroys. This, alongside Favorite of Khorne and the Chaos Icons equipped to the Jackals, gives you a lot of control over your Blessings of Khorne. So if you can play very early and trade Angron for something very heavy on your opponent's side, ideally something that significantly threatens the Lord of Skulls, the Lord of Skulls can then follow up and try to make use of the impact that Angron has created on your opponent's army in order to get you a bunch of Blessed Slaughter triggers. Because the Blessed Slaughter ability triggers for each enemy unit destroyed by the Lord of Skulls, if you had a good turn with the Lord of Skulls, you could potentially be modifying 2 or 3 dice when it comes to your next Blessing of Khorne roll. Alongside the Favorite of Khorne enhancement on the Juggernaut, you can then attempt to re-roll that result in order to get the 3 6s you need to regenerate Angron back into your reserves pool. If you're able to set up this 1-2 punch this way, the Lord of Skulls can actually trigger a very early respawn of Angron, who can then try to close out the game by attacking in the mid to late game. Obviously, it is dependent very heavily on what your Blessings of Khorne look like, but in the instances where it works, it can be a combination that's incredibly difficult to deal with. The other benefit that the Lord of Skulls gives you is a bunch of shooting in the army. That's obviously something that we see very rarely in World Eaters armies, but in my opinion, it does make the army a little bit more consistent, since your opponent doesn't have the opportunity to screen against your melee aggression with impunity. If they are trying to throw units out in front of your army, you can just kill them with the Lord of Skulls without having to commit your 8-bound to the fight. fight. Whereas in other cases where you don't have a big unit like this with a bunch of guns, you may have to commit melee units in order to clear out those screens to open spaces for Angron or your 8-bound units to get to melee in the early game, which means that you're just trading value. However, the Lord of Skulls can just clear out those screening units with all its blast weapons without having to move forward. Now with that, we're going to move over to North Carolina and talk about the Team Heel Hall 40k Grand Tournament. This was a 44-player GT being played in Jacksonville and was won by Aeldari. Riley Morris took Aeldari to a 5-0 record using Devoted of Yniad. Now, I think that that's not too surprising, especially after the changes that the faction saw in the March update. There were some nerfs to the more popular varieties of Aspect Warriors, which I think has put a lot of the emphasis for the faction onto Devoted of Yniad. The internal balance of Eldar and the balance of the Devoted of Yniad detachment in specific is going to be an interesting discussion, I think, once the metagame settles out a little bit. Now, this list in particular was running both the Visearch and Yvraine. We saw a unit of Corsair Void Reavers for a nice cheap battle line unit with some forward operation. We had a single Wave Serpent, as well as 2 units of Dark Reapers, 3 units of Fire Dragons, 5 in each of those units, a unit of Howling Banshees, as well as 2 units of Striking Scorpions, 2 Warlock Skyrunners, 2 units of Warp Spiders, 3 Wraith Lords, and a unit of 10 Ynnari Incubi. We have a lot of utility options available, obviously, from the Aspect Warriors. The Warp Spiders are fast, on-board movers that are able to close the distance early, as well as the Striking Scorpions to give the army some very powerful forward operators. Importantly, we also have the Warlock Skyrunners as well, which offer you a very fast-moving, move 14, 4+ invulnerable save, protected single entity unit. These guys are not character keyworded, so they don't give up any secondaries besides no prisoners potentially, and are able to very easily get to positions to score, which then force your opponent to deal with them to prevent them from scoring in future turns, which then can trigger your lethal intent. These guys for 45 points allow you to offer up your opponent the capacity to trigger your lethal intent early, while not forcing you to expose your more expensive and high-value Aspect Warrior unit. The biggest beneficiary of lethal intent right here is most likely going to be the Ynnari Incubi. These guys are able to dual attach with both Yvraine and the Visearch, so they get a ton of multi-damage devastating wound attacks, plus the full rerolls from Yvraine if she's able to get to melee with a charge target, and that alongside the mass 2 damage attacks from the Incubi themselves is able to make this unit very dangerous. We then have a bunch of Wraith Lords, which are just a hyper-efficient profile independently, and very good when benefiting from many of the other detachment abilities that Ynnari gives them access to. Altogether, pretty standard stuff from Ynnari. Oftentimes we see either a focus on Aspect Warriors or a focus on the big monsters like Wraith Lords or the Incarn. This list kind of threads the needle between both, taking both the Wraith Lord but sacking the Incarn for a higher volume of units, which I think is a cool happy medium in between the two varieties. Now with that, we're going to move over to Ontario, Canada to talk about the All Is Dust GT. This was a 72-player GT that was won by Zach Como running Astra Militarum, going 6-0 to win the event. And this wasn't the standard Bridgehead Strike, Mechanized Assault varieties of Astra Militarum that we've been seeing. Instead, Zach was running Hammer of the Emperor, the vehicle and squadron-focused detachment for the faction. This included 2 Rogel Dorn tank commanders, one of them running Calm Under Fire. This allows this officer to duplicate one order that it issues to another unit each turn. So, for example, it can order Take Aim to a unit, order a free Take Aim thanks to the enhancement, and then choose a second order for its final standard datasheet order. We then had a Tech Priest engines here and some free stratagems being applied by Ursula Creed. Ursula Creed does only benefit regiment units with her command point discount effect, which means that many of the stratagems in the detachment won't really synergize too well with her. However, you can use units like Sentinels, which are both regiment and squadron keyworded, to still affect them with the squadron-specific stratagems for free. From there, we also have 2 Toroxes, as well as several heavy weapon squads, 3 mortar-equipped Catachin heavy weapon teams. These guys can receive orders from Ursula Creed, so she's able to easily take aim all these units, and they are relatively inexpensive, so we're just going to get a battery of backline shooting in order to knock down light infantry in the early game. That's especially good for armies like this that are susceptible to being movement blocked, since they are otherwise very vehicle-centric. So if you can clear out light infantry, your 5-man utility unit, before they're able to move in and occupy the space that your vehicles would rather be standing in, the better for your army. We then have 2 Hellhounds to remove cover from enemies for the big battle tanks to shoot at them, and also clear infantry with their 2d6 18-inch range Inferno cannons. They also act as a very solid Overwatch threat. We have 2 Leman Russ battle tanks. These guys are both equipped with multi-melta and las cannon hull-mounted weapons, as well as obviously their big battle cannon on top, with hit rerolls and targeting enemies on objectives. 2 units of Ratlings for some early game forward operation. We've also seen these guys embark into dedicated transports like the Toroxes that the list includes, in order to be able to shoot and then use their Fire and Fade ability to move back into the Aurochs at the end. Whether or not we're using that in this detachment, since it doesn't have a ton of internal synergy, is an open question, although I don't know if there are many other infantry units that can embark into those Aurochs that we are including. Beyond the heavy weapon teams and the characters, I think the Ratlings are the only things that can go in there. However, the Aurochs are still useful inside this detachment, even if we're just immediately disembarking things from them on turn 1. Obviously, they are dedicated transport, so they have to be embarked on in the early game. However, having access to extremely cheap 65-point squadron keyworded units is hugely beneficial, since these guys can use the mobility improving effects of the detachment, like auto 6 advances and the ability to crash through walls for a command point, in order to act as kind of big, bulky utility units. We then also have a single standard Rogeldorn battle tank for a total of 3 Rogeldorns when including the tank commanders, as well as a single scout sentinel to improve the accuracy of the army slightly. Again, we can also use basically any of our stratagems on the scout sentinel and still get those stratagems for free, or at least at a discounted cost, thanks to Ursula Creed, which can also allow us to improve the mobility of this little guy if we want it to push forward and use Daring Recon to buff our attacks against a particular enemy. Hammer of the Emperor is a really interesting detachment in Astra Militarum. I think that it got a little maligned when the Codex was first released, and definitely paled in the comparison to some of the other detachments, like Bridgehead Strike, I think, obviously. But now that that detachment has been significantly depowered, I think it looks a lot better. One of the biggest downsides of Astra Militarum armor is its maneuverability and its flexibility, and Hammer of the Emperor gives you access to effects like faster advances, advancing and shooting with your vehicles, as well as falling back and shooting, which are all things that are basically unavailable to them in most other detachments. And given the fact that the hull profiles on most of these vehicles are incredibly efficient, making those units more reliable when it comes to a scrum in the center of the table is hugely beneficial to it. Many armies will not have the capacity to knock down as many Rogeldorn and Leman Russ profiles as this army is placing down, and while some armies are also hoping to simply outrace these armies by movement blocking them or by hiding out of line of sight until we come to the close of the game, that's not quite as available to an army using this detachment because these tanks can be so fast. Clearly, that worked out for Zach because he was able to go 6-0 at the event, and it's going to be interesting to see if we see more Astra Militarum players dropping their old, more infantry-focused varieties of the faction for this very vehicle-centric build. Now, with that, we're going to move over to Kansas City, Missouri for the Planet Arcanite 2025 GT. This was a 40-player GT and was taken down by Jacob Andes running Chaos Demons. Jacob was playing the brand new detachment Shadow Legion. This is the Be'lakor-centric detachment that gives you access to Chaos Space Marine units inside your Chaos Demons army, and includes a bunch of incredibly powerful passive effects for demonic units based on their allegiance keywords. This includes effects like a transhuman or bodyguard style of effect for Nurgle units, giving enemies -1 to wound them if their strength beats the toughness characteristic of the demon, -1 to hit Tzeentch units, and advance and charge for Khorne units. This is really where a lot of the power from this detachment comes. It has a lot of overlap with other detachments like Demonic Incursion, where it has access to things like up-down effects and some improved AP. However, the big benefit is that on the table, your demons are way more effective than they are in other detachments because of these passive effects. This army was including Be'lakor. He's kind of a requirement for the detachment because he's able to benefit anything in the detachment, including the Chaos Space Marines with his auras. He also gains an auto-passing Dark Pact, which gives all of his attacks probably sustained hits over the course of the game, which is a dramatic improvement to his damage output, especially considering that he now has access to reroll ones to hit, meaning that he's likely at a greater than 100% conversion rate for his hit rolls. We then have 2 Bloodthirsters, one of them playing Fade to Darkness and the other one with Leaping Shadows. Leaping Shadows is an interesting enhancement on one of the Bloodthirsters. It gives him Scout 9 inches, which is pretty neat. That pushes his turn 1 threat range to absolutely astronomical levels. Since he's already a move 12 flying unit and has access to advance and charge, he can very easily reach into your opponent's deployment zone on the top of the first turn if he's not properly screened, or at least deploy out in the open and then use that 9-inch Scout to move into some defensive terrain features in the center of the table. Obviously, demons have very strong access to forward operators like Nurglings, which gives them the ability to screen out enemy forward operators Warriors who could prevent this Bloodthirster from getting into that defensive terrain. So this is actually a pretty interesting combination. The other Bloodthirster, however, is running the Fade to Darkness enhancement, which is another one of the most powerful things in the detachment. This gives him the ability to return into Deep Strike after he destroys an enemy unit at the end of the fight phase, which gives him basically the same effect as Warp Talons do in the Chaos Space Marine faction. The difference between Warp Talons and a Bloodthirster, however, is that Warp Talons are Strength 5, AP 2, 1 damage melee attacks, whereas a Bloodthirster does more damage than that. He's also a 320 point enormous monster, so giving him the capacity to commit into an engagement, clear out a bunch of enemies, and then return into Deep Strike makes him very difficult to engage with. You can use this guy in the early game to clear out light infantry or screens without having to commit any of your demons permanently to the fight, since he's going to be able to immediately go back into Deep Strike and then rapid ingress back in on your turn to then push forward into the meatier heart of your opponent. Rapid ingress is also particularly easy in this build because we do have Be'lakor who can prevent enemies from shooting at him when he arrives, even if he's out in the open, as long as he's not within 18 inches of any enemies. And again, he has advance and charge, so he's able to close that distance on the subsequent turn really easily. This enhancement, to be perfectly honest, might be a little too cheap on these big greater demons. We then have 2 units of Plague Bearers for their incredible resilience, one gaining that -1 to wound effect. One of them is always important to hold down your back objective and lock it in, but then we also have another unit that can act as a utility. We have a single Beast of Nurgle for some early game utility, another that has access to Scout, as well as 2 units of Flamers. These are relatively resilient utility units. They're good at clearing light infantry, but they also have -1 to be hit and a bunch of wounds. A 4+ vulnerable save with 3 wounds apiece for only 65 points is an absolute steal. And since there's Tzeentch keyworded, you can use Death Denied to regenerate models back into the unit to keep the unit topped up as the game goes on. We then have 2 units of Fleshhounds for some additional utility. They're fast on the table and have a natural up-down now, so they're able to redeploy around the table to complete actions really easily. We have a single Cultist mob in our allies section here in order to give us some additional utility on the battlefield. We're not taking any Nurglings, which I find interesting, which I would expect to see if we are taking that Scout enhancement on the Bloodthirster to prevent enemy scouts from preventing it from moving. But ultimately, I wonder if the calculus is simply that any of those Scout units that are placed too far forward into the demon line on turn 1 will likely simply die to the Fade to Darkness Bloodthirster and be removed for free. We then have some shooting from 2 Nurgle Soul Grinders as well. This gives them the Nurgle detachment ability, which is again that -1 to be wounded if against high strength weaponry. So we have a relatively high wounds count, strong and vulnerable save vehicle with a -1 to wound effect, making most anti-tank weapons wounded on 4s, which makes them really difficult to kill, especially considering the fact that you have to get up close and personal to attack them, since within 6 inches of Be'lakor, they're most likely going to be untargetable outside 18 inches. That gives the army some okay ranged output, since they have an indirect fire weapon in addition to their Harvester Cannon, so we can poke at enemies from a long distance before committing in with the melee units, and force enemies to come into the army and fight the Bloodthirsters in order to actually make up ground against the demon army. I think it's likely in the near future that we'll see a lot of these builds see some play. As I mentioned previously, right now it's a little bit difficult for them to gain a lot of value against really high attack count armies like the Mordaka Ork builds that are currently absolutely dominating, and we saw a lot of demon armies go down to Orks in semifinals and finals games of a lot of the GTs this weekend. But I have a sneaking suspicion that armies like this are going to be very powerful once we see the metagame solidify a little bit. Now with that, we're going to move over to New Zealand and talk about the OTT 2025, a 30-player event that was won by Ezra Blow running Adeptus Custodes. And not any Adeptus Custodes, but the brand new detachment Lions of the Emperor. This is the new March content drop detachment for the faction that grants them +1 to hit and +1 to wound when they are attacking outside of 6 inches of any friendly units. If you operate your Custodes units as single points of golden light against a tide of enemies, tiny elite cadres of warriors acting independently over the battlefield, they are going to gain so much additional value. Ezra was playing 2 Blade Champions as well as an Alaris Terminator Shield Captain with the Admona Mortis enhancement. This is a incredibly powerful offensive enhancement that gives him +3 to his strength characteristic and +1 to AP and damage, granting his Castellan Axe 6, strength 9, AP 2, 4 damage melee attacks. When he's attached into an Alaris Custodian unit, he's also gaining full wound rerolls when targeting characters, monsters, or vehicles, i.e. most of the units in the opponent's army, meaning that this guy is going to basically be able to one-shot most opposing vehicles. This offensive profile is absolutely wild. We then have a single unit of 4 Custodian Guard alongside a bunch of Alaris Custodians, 1 unit of 2, as well as a unit of 3. These guys obviously are very good at acting independently, gaining +1 to hit and wound, especially because the detachment ability includes ranged attacks in addition to melee attacks, means that these guys are going to be able to plink wounds off of even heavily armored enemies. If they're shooting at monsters or vehicles, they're gaining full wound rerolls and wounding them on 5s or even 4s with their massive number of grenade launcher and guardian spear shots. Not to mention the fact that one of these units likely has the shield captain inside it, so they're going to be able to do some absolutely insane damage once they get to grips in melee. We have 2 Caladius Grav tanks. These guys do not get the benefit of the detachment ability. However, they can be used to maneuver and fire for a command point to allow them to fall back and still shoot and charge, which means that engaging them is going to be a little difficult. From there, we have 2 units of Custodian Wardens to attach in with the Blade Champions, alongside 2 units of Prosecutors for utility, and Inquisitor Draxus, who's going to be joining the 4 Custodian Guard for all of the million reasons that Kyria Draxus is good in Custodian Guard units. I don't know if we need to continue to talk about that because we've done it so many times at this point. So generally, we have a lot of similar powerful units that we see in many Custodes armies. 2 Caladius Grav tanks to provide backline shooting, alongside Custodian Wardens. However, that's also buffed by 2 units of Valaris Custodians, one of them with that shield captain, which can provide some really, really strong rapid ingress threats, as well as good infantry clearing to sweep out screens that could potentially be preventing those Wardens from getting to their chosen targets. Since the army is relatively low unit count, the Wardens can essentially assume a flank each, and the Alaris Custodians are oftentimes going to be either rapid ingressing and moving away from the rest of the army, or trying to deep strike into the backline of the opponent's army. It's going to be gaining the effects of that detachment ability pretty consistently over the course of the game, especially if you are careful about your positioning and your charge moves. It's really cool to see some success from Lions of the Emperor because this detachment looks absolutely wild. Once you start getting these already very strong Custodian melee profiles that are buffed by Martial Katas, +1 to wound consistently over the course of the game, and especially including the fact that they're gaining +1 to wound on their ranged attacks as well, especially considering the fact that I'm just looking at it now, the detachment ability affects your Custodes units, not your Custodian models, which means that units like Kyria Draxus attached to a Custodian Guard unit will also benefit from the +1 to wound. Once you start committing your ranged attacks to the fight, the relatively mid-strength, like mediocre, but ranged attacks that Custodian units all have, they actually can start applying some very serious damage with just shooting. Shooting a bunch of 2 damage shots with wound rerolls, thanks to the Custodian Guard rule, and double shots from Sentinel Storm can actually take down a vehicle by themselves if the opponent's save characteristic is not particularly high. And with that, those are all the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this week. But with that, we're going to move on to some community Q&A. This is a new segment that I started doing last week. I've been creating posts on my Patreon and YouTube community pages for supporters to ask questions that I'll answer on this video series. You can join my Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise or my YouTube channel membership at the link down below the video if you are interested in submitting questions to this segment. First off, from the Patreon, Lodar asks, should Blast be made better? I look at it as a bonus, not something I look for in a profile. I think that's a really interesting question, and to be perfectly honest, I think the Blast mechanic is fine currently as it stands. One kind of classic truth of Warhammer 40k is that because of the lethality of the game in general, you do have many units on the table, each of which is equipped with very strong weapons. Lighter units, like light infantry units that tend to be high volume but low defensive characteristics, tend to die in droves already, especially once you consider that Warhammer's melee mechanics are also very lethal, and so even units that are kind of glass cannons but have to act very aggressively, commit into the fight, they tend to naturally attrition themselves. They'll take damage from Overwatch, they'll take damage from opposing unit swingbacks, which oftentimes makes enormous horde armies kind of difficult to play in Warhammer 40,000, but for those reasons, I don't think that we really need more ways to kill large units like that. I think that they're already kind of preyed upon by 40k's natural mechanics, and I think it's okay that Blast is simply a bonus for some weapons. One of the big dangers, I think, of giving flat bonuses to Blast are the weapons that are nominally anti-tank weapons that also have Blast. You can think about things like plasma cannons and battle cannons that are multi-damage, relatively mid to high strength weapons that have Blast on their profile, that if Blast is improved, go from being sort of solid all-rounder weapons with a focus on anti-tank to being just good against literally every target. What I would prefer to see is the really, really low strength, low AP weapons get some sort of statistical improvement, or even maybe an ability that gives them a bonus against lighter targets. Something like +1 to hit if you're targeting an enemy that is above 10 models or something, for especially weapons like frag missile launchers. Those weapons tend to be much maligned because, again, the game is already so toxic to their chosen target profile that they don't really see that much play. And buffing the Blast keyword innately, I think, gives too many buffs to already played weapon profiles. So I'd rather see those weapon profiles in particular get some love. In addition, Caldor Draco 6808 asks that they just realize that the AP buff from the Chaos Space Marine Sorcerer applies to demons. Do you think he's worth considering? I think the implication here is specifically in Shadow Legion lists from Chaos Demons themselves. Interestingly, I saw a lot of people question whether or not this was maybe a typo, that the Chaos Sorcerer's Death Hex psychic ability applies to any attack, not just attacks made by Chaos Space Marine units. But given that Chaos Space Marines are kind of nominally an army that is meant to ally pretty significantly, either having access to Chaos Knights, other varieties of Chaos Space Marines, although I know they gain the Heretic Astartes keyword, but also being able to summon in demonic allies as well. This is probably intentional to allow him to synergize with those units, but I also think that it does make him a very strong inclusion in Shadow Legion armies. That said, currently Shadow Legion armies are focused fairly heavily on Khorne demons, and those already have access to an Honor the Chapter style of effect from the detachment already. So I don't know if you necessarily need plus AP for those models. However, if you are playing a more ranged, focused variety of the detachment, something that's taking things like Havocs or maybe even Lords of Change, I do think that the Chaos Sorcerer makes those things really, really powerful. Even just including him as a little utility unit that can provide some additional buffs and also unlock your 2-unit up-down, I think is a pretty solid inclusion already. Downside, he's a little expensive and inconsistent. Again, I wish that the Psychic mechanic wasn't just a 2+ roll that sort of destroyed you if you fail it. At least give it the ability to CP reroll or something. I think that would be nice. But ultimately, I think it's still definitely worth a consideration, especially in those armies that are focusing on relatively low AP weapons. The double Bloodthirster builds, like we've been seeing more recently, have a lot of AP4 in there that don't necessarily need +1 AP, but stuff that's firing AP2 or AP3 weapons certainly would love to benefit from that. And with that, those are our community questions. Thanks to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise, obviously on the community. Also, thanks to Adept Roll for sponsoring this video. That's going to be it for today. I will see you in 2 weeks, and I'll see everyone who comes to visit me at Adepticon. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.